Studies Section 9, Macroeconomic Policies, Exchange Rate Regimes, and Capital Flows. Introduction. Chapter 8 exposed us to important issues in open economy macroeconomy. In the chapter, we found that it is hardly possible to both achieve full employment and balance of payment equilibrium by adopting either fiscal policy or monetary policy only. In fact, the lesson from the chapter shows that policymakers will need as many policy instruments as it has targets. Although, the Swan diagram shows that internal and external balance cannot be attained simultaneously if the authority adopts either fiscal or monetary policy only, it did not show explicitly how this achievement is possible, and this is what led to the development of ISLMBP framework. Again, as simple as ISLMBP is, it appears very difficult to attain in reality. This is because, first, the framework was based on the assumption that countries adopt flexible exchange rate. Second, the framework assumed that capital is mobile. We discovered earlier that countries adopt different exchange rate regimes. Also, in reality, the mobility of capital varies across countries. While in some countries, capital flow is relatively perfect such that any variation in interest rate will lead to large capital flow, capital is relatively immobile in some other countries, particularly in some developing countries. In some countries, capital flow is absolutely immobile, particularly in some least developed countries. Our task, therefore, in this chapter is to examine the potency of the ISLMBP under various exchange rate regimes and capital flow so as to tackle some knotty issues in open macroeconomics. Objectives. At the end of this lecture, you must be able to do the following. Articulate the implication of monetary policy on the ISLMBP under alternative exchange rate regimes and capital mobility. Articulate the implication of fiscal policy on the ISLMBP under alternative exchange rate regime and capital mobility. Explain why and when the policymakers may get the assignment right or wrong. Policy mix and exchange rate policy. The starting point is to find out if it is possible to achieve both internal and external balance by combining fiscal and monetary policies without the need to adjust exchange rate. A simple analysis of transmission mechanism will help. Suppose the authority intends to achieve these objectives by increasing money supply. This can be done by purchasing bonds, which then leads to increase in the demand for bond and drives the price of bond upwards with a resultant effect of decrease in interest rate. Decrease in interest rate will lead to increased investment, increase in income, and increase in imports. Increase in imports will lead to current account deterioration, while low interest rate will lead to outflow of capital, leading to capital account deficit. If the two accounts are in deficit, overall balance of payment will be in deficit. The lesson from this textbook analysis is that expansionary monetary policy cannot attain both internal balance and external balance. Consider now the use of fiscal policy. If the authorities increase government expenditure, which can be done through the sale of government bonds at a good interest rate, IS will shift rightwards. The rightward shift implies decrease in the price of bond, leading to increase in interest rate. With increase in interest rate, capital inflow will rise so that capital account is in surplus. However, the expansionary fiscal stance will lead to increase in income and hence increase in import with the resultant effect of worsening current account. The net effect of fiscal policy appears indeterminate because such policy will worsen one account and improve the other. Sterilized and non-sterilized intervention. When the government embark on sterilized intervention in the foreign exchange market, the authorities tend to redeem, offset the money, base effect exchange market to ensure that the reserve changes due to intervention do not affect the domestic money base. When the authority embarks on non-sterilized intervention, it allows these reserve changes resulting from their intervention to affect the monetary base. Monetary policy under fixed exchange rate regime. We now turn to using ISLM-BP framework to examine the implication of monetary and fiscal policies under alternative exchange rate. First, consider expansionary monetary policy. In this case, increase in the high-powered money or the monetary base. Suppose the authorities wanted to attain full employment by using this policy. This will shift LM curve downward from LM0 to LM1 as shown in figure 9.1. Now, suppose that the authority maintains fixed exchange rate. The downward shift of the LM curve will mount downward pressure on interest rate, which induces increase in investment and hence increase in income. The economy will then find itself on the right-hand side of the BP curve, indicating that the current account is in deficit. This makes sense because first, low interest rate will induce capital outflow, thereby causing capital account to slump to deficit. Second, increase in income will raise import demand and this will worsen current account. Intuitively, current account deficit implies that there exists too much money, excess money supply on the foreign exchange market. Since the authorities are adopting fixed exchange rate, the excess currency will have to be purchased with the country's reserve, that is, the authorities will have to draw down the reserve. As the authorities are doing this, interest rate begins to rise and capital begins to flow in. Also, investment begins to fall, national income falls, leading to decrease in import demand with the resultant effect of current account improvement. This process will continue until the LM shifts back from LM1 to LM0, the red arrow. This implies that when the authorities embark on non-sterilized intervention, intervening in the foreign exchange market by buying domestic currency and selling foreign currency to influence monetary base, the economy will experience no real effect. That is, the full employment will not be achieved and thus the economy will fail to achieve the targeted internal balance. Now, suppose the authority intends to pursue a sterilized reserve changes. As monetary base falls due to reduction in reserve, the authorities will intervene by pumping more money into the economy and this shifts LM curve back to LM1, leading to decrease in interest rate so that the previous transmission will repeat itself. A close look at this policy of sterilization reveals the fact that the economy will suffer continuous balance of payments deterioration and a continuous fall in reserve. If this policy continues, reserve will eventually dry off and devaluation will be inevitable. How soon reserves dry off depends on the size of reserves, the speed with which reserve accumulates, and the size of sterilization. Fiscal policy under fixed exchange rate. Suppose that the economy is operating a fixed exchange rate. Now, assuming that the economy is operating below capacity, thus the economy will be at equilibrium specified as point A. If this is the case, it means the authorities succeeded in achieving external balance but not internal balance. Now, suppose the government wants to eradicate unemployment by raising government spending. This policy will cause the IS curve to shift from IS0 to IS1 and IS is equal to LM at point B, figure 9.2. At this point, unemployment has been eliminated and the economy achieves internal balance but not external balance. This is because at point B, income has increased and the increase in income will lead to increase in import. Increase in import will lead to deterioration of current account. Note that increase in government expenditure also leads to increase in interest rate, which must induce capital inflow. The overall balance of payment will be in deficit because the economy is to the right of the BP curve. As a result of current account deficit, the authorities will purchase home currency in the foreign exchange market. Now, suppose that the authorities adopt sterilized policy, the LM curve will remain at LM0. This then implies that using only one policy instrument, fiscal expansion, the authorities can only achieve internal balance while external balance will be out of hand. Suppose the government wants to achieve the two targets, then they need to combine fiscal expansion with monetary contraction. By so doing, LM curve will shift from LM0 to LM1. This type of monetary contraction will mount more pressure on interest rate to rise and hence induces more capital inflow. The inflow will continue until it is sufficient to eradicate the current account deficit. This shows that by combining an expansionary fiscal policy and contractionary monetary stance, the authorities can achieve both internal and external balance. Thus, the wisdom from this is that the authorities can achieve both internal and external balance by combining only fiscal policy and monetary policy, leaving exchange rate fixed. Monetary policy under floating exchange rate. Recall that the Swan diagram shows that if exchange rate policy is combined with expenditure changing policy, we can achieve both internal and external balance. However, the framework did not show the likely difference between the choice of combining exchange rate changes with monetary policy as opposed to exchange rate changes and fiscal policy. Suppose that the initial equilibrium is at point A in figure 9.4. Now, let the authority embark on monetary expansion. This will shift LM from LM0 to LM1 and the economy achieves internal balance at point B. At this point, the current account is in deficit due to increase in income which induces more import and lower interest rate which induces capital outflow. To correct this problem, exchange rate will respond by depreciating and this will shift the BP curve from BP0 to BP1 and IS will shift from IS0 to IS1 due to increase in income generated by decrease in the price of export. At this point, the economy is to the left of LM curve, indicating that the authorities need to mop up excess liquidity in the system before achieving both IB and EB. This is done. The LM curve will shift backwards so that the three curves settle at point C. This point produces a lower interest rate and increase in income. Thus, by using monetary policy together with exchange rate policy, it is possible to increase output and also achieve external balance simultaneously. The summary of the analysis is shown symbolically below. Shift in IS curve, capital outflow, shift in BP curve, shift in LM curve. Now, let us consider the case of fiscal policy. We need to assume that BP curve is steeper than LM curve in this case, just as before. The reason for this assumption is that capital flow is insensitive to interest rate changes. We shall consider the case of flatter BP later. With this assumption, suppose that the economy is at equilibrium at point A in figure 9.5. At this point, the economy is at equilibrium but operating below capacity, implying that internal balance is not achieved. To achieve internal balance, the authority embarked on fiscal expansion. This will shift IS curve to the right to produce point B. At this point, the authority appears to achieve internal balance, but there tends to be two opposing effects that the policy generated. The first one is that fiscal expansion leads to increase in interest rate, which will induce capital inflow. The second is that such expansion creates more income, which will induce increased import demand. However, with the assumption of relatively capital immobility, the negative effect of current account deficit will be more than offset the positive effect of capital inflow so that the economy will be to the right of the BP curve. That is, overall balance of payment is in deficit. The deficit will lead to depreciation of exchange rate and by implication shift BP curve to the right and IS curve will shift further to the right. The economy settles finally at equilibrium, producing Y and I asterisk. Hence, the worsening of the balance of payment as a result of increase in income is offset by a combination of increase in interest rate and exchange rate depreciation. Monetary policy under fixed exchange rate regime and perfect capital mobility. When capital mobility is perfect, any marginal change in interest rate will lead to large change in capital flow. For instance, any slight increase in domestic interest rate relative to world interest rate will create considerable incentive for foreign investors to purchase domestic bonds, and this will lead to large inflow of capital. As demand for bond is on the increase, there will be pressure on the price of bond to rise. Increase in bond price will precipitate domestic interest, and this will cause the system to reverse itself. What this implies is that under perfect capital mobility, BP curve is horizontal at a going interest rate. Suppose the economy is operating at point E in figure 9.5. At this point, the authorities have achieved external balance but yet to achieve internal balance. This is because the level of output that is consistent with the equilibrium interest rate is below full employment Y. Now, suppose the authorities intend to achieve full employment by pumping more money into the economy. This action will shift LM curve from LM0 to LM1. If this is the case, there will be pressure on interest rate to fall, and as a result, domestic investors will find it beneficial to purchase foreign bond, and this action will lead to massive outflow of capital. Outflow of capital will lead to devaluation of domestic currency, in which case the authorities will purchase domestic currency at the foreign exchange market with reserves. The purchase of domestic currency implies reducing money supply. Reduction of money supply will lead to increase in interest rate, which will then lead to decrease in income and hence decrease in import. This implies that under perfect capital mobility, any attempt to pursue a sterilized policy will result in large reserve loss without any real change in output. Thus, under perfect capital mobility and fixed exchange rate regime, monetary policy is ineffective. Move out of the economy, and as this process continues, interest rate continues to rise and the economy moves along the LM1 curve until it settles at point E1. At this point, interest rate is still high asterisk as before the shock, but income has increased. That is, the authorities have succeeded in achieving both internal and external balance. Thus, if capital is perfectly mobile in a country, and the country adopts fixed exchange rate regime, then fiscal policy will effectively achieve both internal and external balance. Fiscal policy under floating exchange rate and perfect capital mobility established a fair that if the authorities adopt fixed exchange rate, monetary policy will be ineffective to attain both internal and external balance under perfect capital mobility, while fiscal policy will be effective. Let us examine how internal and external balance can be attained when the authorities embark on floating exchange rate with perfect capital mobility. Suppose the economy is initially at point E in figure 9.8. At this point, equilibrium interest rate that is consistent with level of income cannot attain full employment. Why? Of course, the authorities will want to achieve full employment, and so they choose fiscal policy to do this. With fiscal expansion through the sale of bonds, total expenditure will increase, and at the going interest rate, IS curve will shift from IS0 to IS1. The supply of bonds will lead to a decrease in the price of bonds, and this will put pressure on interest rate to rise. Since capital is perfectly mobile, increase in interest rate will lead to massive inflow of capital from abroad with the resultant effect of appreciation of domestic currency. Because of the assumption that the authorities adopt floating exchange rate, as capital inflow generates appreciation, export become expensive and import become cheap. Thus export will fall, import will rise, and as a result, current account will slump to deficit. The decrease in export and increase in import implies reduction in income, so that the IS curve shifts back from IS1 to IS0. The message from this analysis is clear. If capital is perfectly mobile and if the authorities embark on floating exchange rate policy, then fiscal policy will be ineffective at ascertaining internal balance because such policy will have an eventual zero influence on output. Suppose that the authorities wish to achieve full employment by using monetary policy instead of fiscal policy. In this case, the authorities will increase money into the economy through the printing of new currency. At the going income level, this action will shift the LM curve from LM0 to LM1 as shown in figure 9.9. Two immediate effects will follow this action. First, increase in money supply will lead to decrease in interest rate, which will increase in investment and consumption and hence increase in income. The increase in income will lead to increase in imports. Second, decrease in interest rate will lead to massive capital outflow and hence currency depreciation with the resultant effect of current account deficit. Since the authorities adopt floating exchange rate and hence need intervention to prevent depreciation, the system will do the necessary adjustment. Depreciation will cause exports to be cheap and imports to be expensive. Thus, export earnings will rise and import outlay will fall, and so income will rise so that the IS curve shifts rightwards from IS0 to IS1. After the adjustment is complete, the economy will find itself in point C. At this point, the economy is operating above full employment. Not only that, the current account is not yet completely out of deficit. Meanwhile, the rightward shift of the IS curve causes interest rate to rise, and so there is tendency for capital to flow into the economy from abroad, and as a result, exchange rate becomes stronger again. As a result of this, imports tend to rise and the income tends to reduce. Because of the fact that the monetary expansion is so high that the economy is operating above capacity, the authorities need to contract money supply in order to achieve the set objectives. As a result of this, the LM curve shifts from LM0 to LM1. Both internal balance and external balance are attained at point D. This analysis tells us that under floating exchange rate, monetary policy will be effective if the capital is perfectly mobile. The macroeconomic trilemma. A closer inspection into our analysis so far will reveal the fact that there appear to be three important goals that the authorities want to achieve. These three goals are exchange rate policy, such as fixed exchange rate, monetary independence, such as ability to use monetary policy, and capital flow, such as free capital flow. These three goals have been termed the macroeconomic trilemma or the impossible trinity. This term is used to show how impossible it is to achieve the three goals simultaneously. The recent debate on the impossible trinity reveals the fact that the authorities will only be able to achieve two and let go the other. Figure 9.10 presents the triangular representation of the trilemma. On the left-hand side of the triangle, we have fixed exchange rate and monetary independence. On the right-hand side, we have fixed exchange rate and free movement of capital, while at the bottom of the triangle, we have monetary independence and free movement of capital. That is, the authorities will choose any side they like, which implies that they can only achieve just two of the goals and forfeit the other one. For instance, it is possible for the authorities to use a combination of fixed exchange rate and free movement of capital, the right-hand side, and forget about monetary independence, or a combination of fixed exchange rate and monetary independence and forget about free capital flows. Also, it is possible for the authorities to use a mix of monetary independence and free capital movement but lose control over exchange rate. Some countries have been in one of the three sides. For instance, China took the left side by pegging the renminbi to dollar and also has control over interest rate. What this means is that capital will neither flow in or out, because if capital is allowed to flow in, it will later be the exchange rate that is pegged, and this will result to exchange rate misalignment. United States and United Kingdom take the bottom side. They have control over interest rate, monetary independence, so as to control inflation and to ascertain economic growth. They also allow for capital flow but lose control over exchange rate for them to ascertain the first two goals. For example, if they raise interest rate, this will lead to massive capital inflow, and this will lead to appreciation of their currency, an indication that they cannot maintain a fixed exchange rate. Hong Kong took the right-hand side of the triangle by pegging its exchange rate and allows free movement of capital. However, it has to give up its monetary independence because capital flow will mount pressure on interest rate while exchange rate is kept at fixed. The macroeconomic trilemma is particularly important for developing countries where many of them adopt pegged exchange rates. If they choose to do this, they will either give up control of their monetary power or lose control over free flow of capital for them to have some degree of monetary autonomy, but access to international capital market is important to the medium and long-term economic development. If the authorities liberalize capital flow, then they will have to sacrifice their monetary independence. Nigeria appears to be at the bottom of the triangle, even though its capital market is fraught with series of distortions. The principle of effective market classification. Recall that the Swan diagram informs us that we will need as many instruments as we have targets. However, the target instrument rule says nothing about which instrument to attach with a particular target. The Mundell-Fleming ISLMBP framework shows that it is possible to achieve both internal and external balance by combining a mix of fiscal and monetary policies under alternative exchange rate regimes. As a result of this, Mundell suggested that policymakers should apply effective market classification principle to the instrument target rule. The principle of effective market classification says that any policy used to achieve a particular objective must be the most effective in achieving such objective. For instance, if fiscal policy is the most effective instrument in achieving full employment, while monetary policy is most effective in actualizing balance of payments disequilibrium, then the two policies must be paired to achieve the two targets. This principle is analogous to a lecturer of economics assigned to take on economic lectures, while a building engineer should be assigned to building job and not the other way round. One implication of failing to apply this principle is that the economy may suffer from continuous cyclical instability. That is, such economy may not get the two targets achieved. The assignment problem. When the policymakers are thinking of the appropriate instrument to assign to a set of targets, we say they are facing the assignment problem. However, Mundell tried to solve the problem by calling the attention of the policymakers to the type of exchange rate policy they are adopting and the type of capital mobility facing the economy. According to the scholar, if the economy is operating under fixed exchange rate, then monetary policy must be assigned to external balance, while fiscal policy must be assigned to internal balance. A graphical example of assignment problem is depicted in figure 9.11. The diagram illustrates internal and external balance for various fiscal and monetary policy stances under a fixed exchange rate. The monetary policy is on the vertical axis, while fiscal policy is on the horizontal axis. Monetary policy is neutral at point O on the vertical axis, while fiscal policy is neutral at point O on the horizontal axis. To the left of point O on the vertical axis, the authorities are embarking on monetary expansion, while to the right, they are embarking on monetary tightening. To the right of fiscal policy axis, The authorities are adopting fiscal expansion, while to the left, they are embarking on fiscal contraction. The internal balance curve has a negative slope because if we are initially at full employment, an expansionary fiscal policy must be paired with contractionary monetary policy to maintain full employment. To the right of IB curve, it is either both monetary and fiscal are expansionary or monetary policy is contractionary while fiscal policy is expansionary. In any case, the economy will be experiencing inflation. That is, it may be the case that even when monetary policy is contractionary, fiscal policy is so expansionary that the net effect is inflation. To the left of IB curve, the economy will be experiencing deflation because even if monetary policy is expansionary, fiscal policy contraction is so much that it outweighs the monetary expansion and hence the net effect is unemployment. In the case of external balance, the curve may be negative or positive due to the conflicting effect of both fiscal and monetary policies on the balance of payments. For instance, if the authorities adopt fiscal expansion, it will lead to increase in income, increase in import, and hence worsening of current account. However, such policy will also lead to increase in interest rates sufficiently high as to attract capital inflow with the resultant effect of improving the capital account. In figure 9.11, external balance EB curve is negatively slow. This suggests that expansionary fiscal policy will cause balance of payments deterioration. In this case, we are assuming that increase in imports generated by increase in income due to fiscal expansion is so much as to outweigh the capital inflow arising from relative increase in domestic interest rate. Thus, to maintain external balance, fiscal expansion must be associated with monetary contraction to neutralize the net worsening effect. To the right of EB curve, the balance of payments is in overall deficit. This will be the case if the authority embark on both fiscal and monetary expansion, or when either monetary policy is so expansionary that fiscal contraction cannot neutralize it, or when fiscal expansion is so much that monetary contraction cannot fully accommodate it, and so the economy experiences current account deficit. To the left of EB curve, balance of payments will be in surplus. This will be the case if monetary contraction outweighs fiscal expansion, or if fiscal contraction is more than monetary expansion. Another important point to note in the graph is that IB is steeper than EB, thus is based on the assumption that when fiscal expansion causes 1% increase in income, it will cause less than 1% decrease in balance of payments. If monetary expansion causes 1% increase in income, it will cause more than 1% increase in balance of payments deterioration. This assumption is plausible if you still remember that fiscal expansion leads to both increase in interest rate and imports. Increase in interest rate will lead to capital inflow, while increase in imports will lead to deterioration of current account. Thus, the capital inflow will neutralize part of the current account deficit so that the net effect will be less than 1%. In the case of monetary expansion, this will lead to both deterioration of capital account and current account. The overall effect will be more than 1%. This implies that monetary policy is more effective at influencing EB, while fiscal policy is more effective at influencing IB. Let us now use the assignment problem to analyze the policy stance of government. Suppose that the economy is operating at point A. The authority achieves external balance, but at the expense of inflation. To eliminate inflation, the authorities should embark on fiscal contraction. This will reduce income, and hence the economy will be at point B. The government should then embark on monetary expansion because at point B, the economy is experiencing capital account surplus. The monetary expansion will lead to decrease in interest rate, and this will lead to capital outflow, and EB will be achieved at point C. This process should continue systematically until point V, where IB is equal to EB is attained. It must be noted that the authorities need less and less adjustment of fiscal and monetary policy as the system converges to point V. Suppose the policymakers get the assignment wrong and use monetary policy to eliminate inflation and fiscal policy to attain EB. Such monetary contraction will move the economy to point D, although internal balance is attained. The policy has generated massive balance of payment surplus. Let us assume that the authority wants to deal with the surplus using fiscal expansion. This will move the economy to point C. Clearly, this type of assignment tends to create an unstable economy, and this will put the economy into a long-standing problems. In particular, when policy mix can cause considerable damage to the economy before it is eventually reversed. However, interesting this analysis is it has not addressed the issue of capital flow. For instance, if the economy is such that capital is imperfectly mobile, then the assignment problem does not give a straightforward solution. Also, the analysis suppresses the case of floating exchange rate. Thus, the assignment problem has no simple solution, and it is considerably more complicated if we have more than two targets. In this case, the appropriate pairing of instruments and targets depends on the fundamental factors governing the economy. These fundamentals include degree of capital mobility, marginal propensity to save and import, income elasticity of demand for money, the price elasticity of demand for imports and exports, and the responsiveness of investment to interest rate variations. Pilbeam, 2003. Studies section summary. Monetary policy is not effective under fixed exchange rate, but it is effective under floating exchange rate. Fiscal policy is not effective under floating exchange rate, but it is effective under fixed exchange rate. With perfect capital mobility, fiscal policy alone is effective under fixed exchange rate, but cannot do so under floating exchange rate. Monetary policy only is effective under floating exchange rate under the same capital flow condition. The macroeconomic trilemma shows that out of the three goals that the authorities may be willing to achieve simultaneously, only two can be eventually achieved. The three goals are control over exchange rate operating fixed exchange rate regime, monetary independence dictating the interest rate that should prevail or targeting interest rate, and free capital flow. This implies that a country cannot have control over its exchange rate and interest rate in the face of free capital flow. It will contend with two and let loose the third one. Principle of effective market classification proposes that policy should be used where it is most effective. Monetary policy is most effective in achieving external balance, while fiscal policy is most effective in achieving internal balance. If the policy mix is appropriately used, the economy will attain both internal and external balance. If the economy attains external balance but suffering from inflation, the best instrument is fiscal contraction first, followed by monetary expansion. It is possible to get the assignment wrong if the appropriate policy is not used, and this can cause long-standing economic problem. However, as intuitive as the assignment problem is, it did not say anything about the structural parameters governing the economy. These structural parameters are so important that they cannot be ignored. This is the end of study section 9. Thanks for listening.